Welcome to the deep dive. We're here to extract the core insights from some pretty complex military doctrine and, well, translate that into knowledge you can use. Today, we are taking a particularly intensive deep dive. We're looking at military operations in, frankly, the most extreme environments you can imagine. We're analyzing what's called the integrated battlefield, the planning, the execution, and, crucially, the reality of survival when facing chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear threats. CBRN.
Yeah, and this really takes us right to the heart of modern strategic thinking. Our mission today, if you like, is to distill the core principles the guidance commanders need for planning, executing, and maybe most importantly, surviving in a chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear environment.
And where are we drawing this from? What's our source material?
We're leaning on some foundational stuff. Joint Publication 372, that's the one covering joint nuclear operations, and there's Joint Publication 311, which deals specifically with operations in chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear environments. And we're also pulling in historical wisdom, particularly from the, well, legendary exercise Desert Rock series, alongside the really detailed guidance you find in the Operations on the Integrated Battlefield reference book.
That concept you mentioned, the integrated battlefield, that feels absolutely crucial here because Joint Publication 372 makes it really clear, doesn't it? We're not talking about some kind of switch you flip transitioning into a nuclear environment.
Exactly. Modern doctrine dictates that the planning has to be seamless across all the domains, conventional, cyberspace, space, and yes, the nuclear sphere right from the very start.
You just can't afford to think about these threats in isolation anymore. They have to be integrated into, well, pretty much every single decision. Okay, so to really get a handle on the kind of discipline needed for these integrated operations today, it makes sense to look back. Where did this operational knowledge actually come from?
Yeah, you really have to go back to the 1950s, the Nevada desert. These incredibly ambitious nuclear tests known as Exercise Desert Rock.
And this wasn't just scientists in labs, right? This was operational learning, troops on the ground.
Absolutely. Combat troops,
Yeah.
testing survivability in the extreme. It was really an unparalleled laboratory. If you look at the historical documents on Desert Rock, these exercises were tied to 30 separate nuclear detonations over 6 years, between 51 and 57.
30 detonations. And the scale?
Staggering.
Close
The
up.
70,000 troops took part over those years. They were trying to figure out the limits, How do you fight through this? How do you survive? How do you ultimately win on a battlefield that's potentially contaminated by nuclear weapons?
And some of those troops got incredibly close, didn't they? I mean, the proximity sounds almost unbelievable today.
It does. The Desert Rock documents point out something quite surprising, that no serious injuries happened directly from the detonations themselves, even when they had volunteers in trenches, sometimes as close as 2,000 yards. That's just over a mile from ground zero in some of the later tests.
Wow, 2,000 yards. That speaks volumes, I guess, about the early focus on engineered protection, maybe, and just understanding the physics involved.
It really does. It shows that even with those, relatively low-yield devices compared to modern arsenals, protection factors, shielding, timing, distance mobile, they matter immensely. And these early tests, they reveal some key scientific and operational ideas we still rely on. For instance, a huge one was that nuclear effects don't scale linearly. Meaning if you have a weapon that's, say, 100 times larger in yield, its effects don't just stretch out neatly 100 times farther away. It's a nonlinear relationship.
Okay, and why is that so critical?
Because it means your targeting calculations, your safety planning, it can't rely on simple proportional math. It's much more complex. You need detailed modeling.
Beyond the scaling, what else did those early tests reveal about managing the immediate physical effects, like fallout?
Well, they provided really crucial data on airbursts versus ground bursts. The tests showed that if you detonate an airburst weapon at a height designed to maximize the blast effects on the ground, well, often that detonation is high enough that it doesn't actually suck up a lot of dirt and debris.
Ah, so less local fallout.
Exactly. It doesn't produce those really hazardous levels of local fallout you get from a ground burst.
Yeah.
Now, this knowledge immediately fed into early military thinking about weapon selection and how you'd employ them, and the operational imperatives that came out of this. First, disperse your units immediately. Reduce your vulnerability to a single strike. And second, figure out the protocols for continuing your mission while rigorously minimizing the risks to your people.
Let's make this more concrete. You mentioned diving into a specific case study, Task Force Razor.
Yes, Task Force Razor during Desert Rock 6 Foot. This really brings the operational mindset to life because this wasn't about watching from a distance. This was about driving into the environment right afterward.
Okay, set the scene.
May 5th, 1955, Task Force Razor. This was a heavy mechanized unit. We're talking M48 and M41 tanks, M59 armored infantry vehicles. Their task, move towards ground zero after the Teapot Apple II test. It was a 29 kiloton detonation.
Yeah.
So they were testing maneuverability, protection, communications, the works.
And how soon after the detonation did they move?
8 minutes.
Yeah.
8 minutes after the flash, they started their advance.
8 minutes. What was the environment like then? How did it affect their movement?
The Desert Rock reports, they paint a pretty vivid picture. Conditions were tough. Even if the immediate radiation danger was being managed by, timing and distance decay. The main issue was dust. Thick, pulverized dust. Thrown up by the blast, kicked up by the vehicles. It reduced visibility down to about 800 yards. Some tank crews apparently had to rely heavily on their driving lights just to keep formation and avoid bumping into each other.
So slow going.
Very slow. Convoys were forced down to between 2 and 6 miles per hour. But interestingly, one really positive finding that fed into Doctrine was about communications.
What about?
The radios, all the comms gear, reportedly worked perfectly, which was a key lesson, right? Comms survivability in that immediate post-strike chaos was possible.
Okay, but the really valuable data point here must be about physical protection. What did those heavy armored vehicles actually do for the soldiers inside?
They provided a phenomenal amount of shielding. The Desert Rock data showed that the heavy armor significantly reduced the radiation dose the soldiers inside received.
How much?
Down to about 1/20th. 1/20th of the dose rate that was measured on the map outside the vehicles at that time.
1/20th. Wow.
Yeah. It was mainly because that dense armor was shielding them from gamma radiation. At that point, that radiation was coming from both early fallout settling down and also from neutron activation of the soil itself near ground zero.
So that factor, that 20-fold reduction, that must have been a stunning demonstration of how high-mass shielding works.
Absolutely, and it directly influenced how people thought about designing armored vehicles going forward. Mass equals protection, especially against gamma.
Okay, let's broaden out slightly to equipment survivability in general. Tests like Upshot Knothole Badger and other tests, 23 kilotons, they showed something interesting, right? That equipment and people face different primary threats from a nuclear blast.
They absolutely do. The analysis showed that the air blasts the shock wave, which carries roughly 50% of the energy released, that's the most severe threat to big equipment, vehicles, buildings, fortifications. But, and this is key, the radius where heavy equipment is likely to be structurally damaged or just destroyed by that blast wave. It's relatively small compared to the radius where people are at risk from radiation or thermal burns.
Right. So if I'm a commander planning a mission, I've got this sort of duality to deal with. People versus steel.
Precisely. Your personnel, especially if they're caught in the open or even in simple shelters, they are inherently more susceptible to the thermal pulse, the heat flash, and the initial nuclear radiation, more so than to the physical trauma of the blast wave itself, unless they're very close. But your heavy equipment, your tanks, your armored personnel carriers, they're mainly susceptible to the physical crushing force and the dynamic pressure of that blast wave.
So the implication is you might lose personnel over a wider area due to radiation, even if your heavy gear survives the physical blast closer in.
That's exactly it. Planners today have to grasp that. You might lose, say, a significant portion of your personnel within a certain radius due to radiation effects from a 50-kiloton weapon, even if most of your tanks and trucks within that same radius survive the physical pressure wave relatively intact. Understanding that dichotomy is fundamental to modern force protection planning, logistics, everything.
Okay, so that historical testing, Desert Rock, it laid the groundwork for understanding survival. But modern doctrine, formalized now in Joint Publication 372, Joint Nuclear Operations, it takes those physical effects and embeds them in a much broader contemporary strategic framework, starting with deterrence itself.
Right. Joint Publication 372 clarifies the core purpose, the principal roles for United States nuclear forces today. There are three main ones. First, pretty straightforward, deter strategic attack. That includes any nuclear use at any scale, whether it's against the U.S. homeland or against our forces deployed forward. Second, assure allies and partners. And this is important. This assurance directly contributes to U.S. non-proliferation goals. If allies feel protected under the U.S. nuclear umbrella, they have less incentive to develop their own weapons. And third, if deterrence fails, and this is the grim part that exists to achieve United States objectives, that means limiting escalation, trying to terminate the conflict on terms favorable to the U.S.
And the foundation for all of this, the big strategic concept, is integrated deterrence. That term gets used a lot. Why is this integration so crucial now? And how does Joint Publication 372 actually define how it works?
Well, integrated deterrence is seen as necessary because potential adversaries, especially peer competitors, they don't really separate strategic and tactical nuclear threats from their conventional operations or even their gray zone activities. It's all part of one continuum for them. So the doctrine states that integrated deterrence requires these tailored combinations. You need combat-credible conventional forces, yes, but also assets in cyberspace, space, the information domain. And you employ all of that together with the unique tailored deterrent effects of your nuclear weapons.
So it's not just about having nukes, it's about orchestrating everything together.
Exactly. It's a whole philosophy. It demands aligning policies, investments, military activities, information campaigns, everything to sustain and strengthen deterrence, and importantly, tailoring it to specific competitors and specific challenges they might pose.
Okay, so deterrence isn't just about having the biggest stick. It's about manipulating the opponent's calculation, their perception of risks versus rewards. How does the doctrine describe making deterrence actually work?
It says the U.S. deters attacks by making sure the perceived costs of that attack far, far outweigh any likely gains the adversary thinks they might achieve. Militarily, this works in two main ways. You either threaten to deny benefits, basically, convincing the adversary that whatever they hope to achieve, it's probably not going to happen or isn't worth it, or you threaten to impose costs, making sure the adversary understands the severe, unacceptable consequences that will definitely follow if they take that aggressive action.
And there's that third element mentioned in the doctrine, too, something about encouraging adversary restraint. That sounds a bit more subtle, almost psychological.
It is. It's the more sophisticated side of deterrence, maybe. Encouraging adversary restraint means convincing their decision makers that not doing the aggressive thing we want to deter, that inaction will lead to a better outcome for them than the potentially catastrophic outcome if they do act.
So that requires really understanding the adversary.
Deeply. As Joint Publication 372 emphasizes, you need to understand their values, their risk tolerance, their political situation, their perception of the world. It's about influencing their decision-making calculus, not just pointing missiles at them.
Okay, let's shift towards operational execution. The doctrine heavily stresses conventional nuclear integration. Now, that just sounds like an enormous command and control challenge, a huge logistical puzzle. How does the publication spell out this need for seamless integration?
Yeah, it's a massive undertaking. Conventional nuclear integration is defined as the seamless planning and operation of joint forces, that's multiple U.S. services and potentially combined forces, with allies using both conventional and nuclear capabilities. And doing this in sequence or in parallel, right across what they call the competition continuum, from peacetime competition through crisis and potentially into conflict. The doctrine recognizes that your non-nuclear capabilities have to be planned in ways that enhance or complement your potential nuclear options, and vice versa. It's meant to be a fluid continuum, not some hard fence line between conventional war and nuclear war.
Can we unpack the core parts of this integration? Joint Publication 372 details some specific requirements, right? What does the joint force actually need to be able to do?
Yeah, there are four key dynamics highlighted. First, kind of basic survival. The joint force has to be able to recognize that nuclear weapons have been used, survive that use, reconstitute its critical capabilities, and then continue to plan and operate in that nuclear environment. That's pure force protection and recovery, really. Second is the ability to dynamically plan and execute integrated response options across all domains, land, sea, air, space, cyber, potentially including nuclear responses, to give leaders maximum strategic flexibility.
Okay, and what about the other two? They deal more with how conventional and nuclear capabilities support each other.
Exactly. The third facet is conventional support to nuclear operations. This means using your conventional forces to, say, prepare the operational environment, maybe suppressing enemy air defenses so your nuclear delivery platforms can get through, or providing really precise targeting data to make nuclear options more effective or tailored. And the fourth facet is the flip side. Nuclear support to conventional operations. This is when you might need nuclear capabilities to deter a strategic attack that threatens to overwhelm your conventional forces, or maybe to reestablish deterrence if a conventional fight is going badly, or perhaps to manage escalation by delivering a decisive but hopefully controlled response.
That level of integration, combining all these different types of forces and effects, it must create immense complexity, particularly for commanders. What does Joint Publication 372 flag as the really critical challenges to actually achieving this seamless all-domain operation?
The publication is actually very candid about the difficulties. It lists chronic issues with training, just getting forces proficient in this complex environment. There's the challenge of fusing national-level intelligence with theater-level intelligence. Often these are separate streams of data that need to be brought together coherently, quickly. Reconciling planning factors between conventional and nuclear operations is tough. But perhaps the most difficult challenge mentioned is connecting disparate command, control, and communication systems. Think about linking systems across different military services, and then potentially linking those with allied nation systems, and then coordinating the logistics, fuel, ammo, parts, medical, to support both conventional and nuclear movements, potentially simultaneously.
Yeah, that sounds incredibly hard.
It is. Commanders also need better integrated modeling tools for campaigns, ways to rapidly recover or replace damaged equipment, and methods to synchronize capabilities across a multinational force. It's a long list of very hard problems.
And right at the strategic heart of this whole complex system is nuclear command and control, often called NC2. Who holds the ultimate authority here?
The principle is absolute and central to the whole system. Nuclear command and control demands centralized control and centralized execution. Only the President of the United States has the authority to authorize the use of nuclear weapons. Full stop. That centralized authority is paramount, ensuring accountability and preventing any possibility of unauthorized use.
But those command systems themselves, they have to survive a nuclear exchange to even function, right? We talked about the risk of electromagnetic pulse, EMP. How do planners make sure the nuclear command and control network actually stays up and running after an attack?
That's a massive challenge. Those mission-critical nuclear command and control facilities, the communication links, the equipment, they absolutely must be designed, built, and maintained to resist the catastrophic effects of a nuclear explosion, especially EMP.
Because the pulse could just fry unprotected electronics.
Exactly. It could damage sensitive electronics and disrupt system functionality over vast areas, potentially paralyzing the command structure just when it's needed most. So hardening those communication systems is essential. That means shielding them, building in redundancy, using fiber optics, employing EMP-resistant technologies. Whatever it takes to assure the resiliency and survivability needed to reliably overcome the effects of an adversary's attack and maintain that unbroken chain of command.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. We've talked high-level deterrence strategy. Now let's get down to the tactical ground-level reality. We turn to Joint Publication 311, which covers operations in chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear environments. What defines this uniquely hazardous operational environment today? Is it just traditional chemical weapons we need to worry about?
No, it's much broader now. The definition of chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear hazards has really expanded. Yes, it includes traditional military chemical agents, biological weapons, and nuclear fallout. But now, Doctrine explicitly includes toxic industrial materials.
Toxic industrial materials, like what?
Think toxic industrial chemicals like chlorine gas released from a factory, toxic industrial biologicals, maybe pathogens from a research lab, and toxic industrial radiologicals, radioactive materials from, say, medical equipment or industrial gauges.
So this means a military force has to worry about hazards coming from attacks on civilian infrastructure too, not just enemy weapons.
Precisely. An attack on something like a petroleum refinery, a chemical plant, or even a nuclear power plant could cause an unintentional but potentially devastating release of hazardous materials across a wide area where troops might be operating. It has a whole new layer of complexity to threat assessment.
And one of the most immediate, tangible impacts on the soldiers, the warfighters themselves, is the need to wear protective gear. Mission-oriented protective posture gear, or MOPP gear. What does the doctrine say about the operational effects, the degradation caused by wearing this stuff?
It's significant. Operations slow down dramatically. Your combat tempo just plummets. Joint Publication 311 highlights several critical areas where MOPP gear severely impacts performance. Mobility is restricted. It's just harder to move in the suit. Manual dexterity drops off a cliff. Try doing fine motor tasks with those thick gloves. Visual acuity is impaired by the mask faceplate. Communication is hampered. You're talking through a mask, maybe over radio, it's muffled. And even simple, essential biological functions.
Eating, drinking.
Eating, sleeping, waste elimination.
Yeah.
They become incredibly arduous, time-consuming tasks. Taken together, these degradations impose a massive burden on a commander's ability to react quickly, to perform time-sensitive tasks.
Okay, so given that constant threat hanging over them and the performance hit from wearing the gear, commanders have to be constantly assessing the risk level. How does Joint Publication 311 guide them in figuring out the threat probability and choosing the right MOPP level?
Commanders use a 5-tiered system for threat assessment levels. It goes from minimal, then low, medium, high, and finally critical probability. Minimal threat basically means the adversary doesn't have the capability or maybe the training. Low means they might have the capability, but their intent to use it is unknown or unlikely. But when the assessment reaches high probability, that means the adversary definitely possesses the materials, they have the delivery systems, and intelligence indicates an attack is considered imminent. That demands a very high state of alert and maximum protective readiness.
What are the telltale signs, the key indicators that would push that assessment up to high probability really quickly?
Warning intelligence is absolutely crucial here. Key indicators would include things like observing enemy forces issuing their own chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear warnings or signals to their troops. That's a big red flag. Or seeing definitive physical signs like the movement of surface-to-surface missile systems or specific artillery units known to carry chemical or nuclear warheads moving to their launch sites or firing positions. These kinds of signals provide that critical warning time, maybe minutes, maybe hours, needed for friendly forces to get into MOPP Level 4, which offers the maximum protection.
But knowing the enemy's intent isn't enough, right? Commanders also need to look at their own vulnerability, especially to a potential nuclear strike. The Operations on the Integrated Battlefield Reference Book gets into specific techniques commanders can use to make themselves less of an attractive target.
Yeah, that reference book really hammers home the importance of vulnerability analysis, and it often does it by showing the dramatic benefits of dispersal. It gives a stark example. Imagine a worst-case scenario. You've got a mechanized battalion, maybe tanks and infantry carriers, all concentrated in a fairly tight battle position, say 4 kilometers wide and only 2 kilometers deep.
Okay, pretty packed in.
Right. The book points out that this kind of concentrated formation would face severe damage. We're talking over 50% casualties and equipment destruction from just a single 40-kiloton nuclear weapon detonated somewhere near the middle of their position. That's a catastrophic loss of combat power from one weapon.
But if they spread out, if they disperse,
the outcome changes completely. If that same commander deploys the battalion differently, maybe in 3 company-sized teams, in dispersed battle positions, spread out in depth over, say, 4.5 kilometers or more, well, the potential effect of that single weapon is dramatically reduced. The best that enemy target analysts could hope for with that same 40-kiloton weapon is maybe severely damaging or destroying one of those 3 companies, not wiping out the entire battalion. Dispersal basically transforms a battalion-level threat into maybe just a company-level threat. It's fundamental.
Beyond just spreading out, the goal is really to mess with the adversary's targeting process, right? To deny them the precise information they need to hit you effectively. What kind of practical tactics help reduce that targeting probability?
The Operations on the Integrated Battlefield Reference Book stresses several things. Denying precise information is key. Using camouflage, concealment, deception, strict radio discipline, all that signature management stuff so they don't know your exact unit type, size, or location. Hardening positions is another digging in. Using bunkers forces the adversary to use larger, maybe less accurate weapons or changes their targeting calculations. And significantly reducing electronic signatures, both active radio transmissions and passive things like heat signatures, through careful emissions control measures. Basically, if they can't find you accurately, they can't target you effectively.
And then there's that tactic that always sounds so counterintuitive, hugging the enemy.
Yeah, it sounds crazy, but it's a doctrinally recognized, though obviously high-risk, tactic. It involves deliberately exploiting the adversary's own safety procedures for their troops.
How does that work?
Well, the enemy, if they're planning to use nuclear weapons near the front lines, they have to establish safe distance lines for their own attacking or forward-deployed forces. They don't want to irradiate their own guys right after the blast. These safe distances can be quite large, maybe tens of miles, depending on the weapon yield and terrain. So by operating deliberately in very close proximity to the enemy's forward line, you're essentially getting inside their safety zone. It forces them into a dilemma. Either they have to use much lower yield, potentially less effective weapons near you, or they have to shift their planned ground zero point further away from your forces and their own, which reduces the blast and radiation effects on your troops. It's exploiting their own safety constraints.
Okay, let's get back to the nuts and bolts of protection, the MOPP gear itself. Selecting the right MOPP level seems like this constant tactical balancing act. Risk versus mission performance.
It's a critical trade-off, and commanders are managing it constantly based on the perceived threat level. MOPP level selection is all about balancing the need to minimize risk against the very real task degradation and heat stress imposed by wearing the equipment. MOPP 1 and 2, those involve putting on the items that take the longest to don the overgarment suit, the overboots. You adopt those levels when the threat is increasing. Maybe intelligence suggests it's possible, but an attack isn't immediately imminent. MOPP 3 and 4 add the mask, the hood, the gloves. These impose significantly higher physiological stress, especially heat buildup, and really hamper performance. But they can be donned much more quickly when intelligence or sensors indicate an attack is happening or about to happen. So the commander has to constantly adjust these levels based on the latest intel and the mission requirements to maximize combat effectiveness while minimizing casualties. It's a dynamic decision. And beyond individual protection for really critical assets or functions, commanders can turn to collective protection, or col per. That offers a higher level of safety, right? Yes. Collective protection uses dedicated shelters, maybe tents, hardened buildings, even vehicles equipped with specialized chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear air filtration units. These systems clean the incoming air and maintain a positive pressure inside the shelter relative to the outside.
Positive pressure, meaning air only flows out, not in.
Exactly. That positive overpressure ensures that even if there are tiny leaks in the shelter, contaminants can't leak in. They are absolutely essential for protecting critical nodes like command and control centers. And crucially, they're vital for medical treatment facilities. A col per shelter allows medical personnel and clean patients, those not yet contaminated or already decontaminated, to work and recover inside without the immediate crippling burden of wearing individual MOPP gear. Of course, you have to have strict procedures to make sure contaminated patients are fully decontaminated before they enter, otherwise you compromise the whole shelter.
Okay, so let's say deterrence fails, or an attack just happens. Commanders then have to shift immediately from prevention to survival and recovery, and that demands a really solid understanding of the raw physics, the effects of nuclear weapons. Let's start with initial nuclear radiation, referencing the data in the Nuclear Weapons Handbook 2020 and the operations on the Integrated Battlefield Reference Book.
Right. Initial nuclear radiation is sometimes called prompt radiation. This is that intense burst of energy, mostly neutrons and gamma rays, that's emitted basically within the first minute after the detonation. And the operations on the Integrated Battlefield Reference Book points out a really crucial distinction here. For weapons with yields less than about 50 kilotons, this initial nuclear radiation is usually the governing casualty effect.
Governing casualty effect.
Meaning more people within a certain radius are likely to become casualties from that initial radiation dose than from the blast wave or the heat flash. The radiation hazard reaches out further, effectively.
And that brings us to the human cost. Just how lethal is this initial radiation?
The standard metric often used is the 450 centigrade dose level. That exposure is considered the lethal dose for 50% of the population, the LD50, even if they have access to good medical assistance. And the operations on the Integrated Battlefield Reference Book explains the effects scale up rapidly. A dose above 800 centigrade means pretty much complete permanent incapacitation within about 5 minutes, inevitably followed by death within maybe 30 days. So a commander suddenly facing a 50% casualty rate in a unit, even with the best possible medical care available, well, it fundamentally transforms that unit from a fighting force into an immediate medical crisis.
Okay, moving on to the thermal radiation, the incredible heat and light released. That poses a different kind of immediate danger, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The light flash itself is unbelievably intense enough to cause temporary blindness, which is often called dazzle. The Nuclear Weapons Handbook 2020 notes that on a clear night, this dazzle effect might last for up to 30 minutes and could affect people even 10 miles away or more.
30 minutes of blindness. Wow. And permanent damage.
If someone looks directly at the fireball itself, yes, they risk permanent retinal burns. However, this is largely avoidable. If personnel get even a few seconds warning like flash, cover, and they cover their eyes or drop face down, both the temporary dazzle and the risk of permanent burns can be significantly reduced or prevented.
Okay, the third major effect then is the physical force, the crushing power of the air blast.
Right, the air blast. It's characterized by that incredibly strong positive pressure phase. That's the shock wave that physically crushes things, causes lung injuries, implodes buildings. And that's followed immediately by a negative pressure phase, sort of a vacuum effect, where the air rushes back towards ground zero, causing damaging winds in the opposite direction. And doctrinally, it's important to know that the blast effect, the physical destruction on the ground, is generally maximized by using a low air burst rather than a detonation directly on the surface.
Why is that?
Because with a low air burst, the initial shock wave traveling downwards reflects off the ground, and that reflected wave reinforces the incident waves traveling outwards along the ground. This combined effect, called the Mach stem, maximizes the overpressure and physical damage over a wider area compared to a surface burst of the same yield.
Got it. Finally, we need to be really clear about the difference between that immediate radiation we discussed and the longer-term radiation threats, induced radiation and fallout.
Yes, they often get confused, but the distinction is absolutely vital for survival planning. Induced radiation is radioactivity that's created in the soil, rock, or building materials right near ground zero by the neutrons from the initial blast. Those neutrons get absorbed, turning stable atoms into radioactive isotopes. The intensity of this induced radiation decreases relatively rapidly over time as those isotopes decay. The Nuclear Weapons Handbook 2020 notes that in typical soil, it might take around 5 to 7 days for the induced radiation levels to decay down to where they're considered relatively safe for limited exposure.
Okay, so that's induced radiation near ground zero. What about fallout?
Fallout is different. Fallout consists of the highly radioactive particles, fission products from the bomb itself, plus dirt and debris made radioactive that gets sucked up into the mushroom cloud, especially from a surface or near-surface burst. These particles are then carried downwind by prevailing winds and fall back to Earth over potentially vast areas.
So fallout is the widespread, long-term contamination threat.
Exactly. Fallout is the long-term, widespread hazard that can contaminate huge areas for potentially months or even years, depending on the isotopes involved and the weather patterns. It's a completely different hazard profile than the intense but relatively localized induced radiation field.
Okay, so after an attack, the survival phase kicks in, demanding massive logistical efforts and decontamination. And there's a fundamental difference, isn't there, in how you deal with chemical or biological contamination versus radiological material?
A huge difference. With chemical agents or biological pathogens, often those specific agents can be neutralized maybe through chemical washes, bleach solutions, or specialized decontaminants, or they can be physically removed. You can, in theory, clean them off. But radiological material, radioactive atoms, you cannot neutralize radioactivity itself. The hazard is only reduced by radioactive decay, which happens at a rate determined by the half-life of the specific radionuclide. You can't speed that up.
So, since you can't just neutralize radiation, how do you mitigate the hazard? How do you protect your troops from radioactive contamination or exposure?
You have to rigorously apply those 3 core principles we mentioned earlier: time, distance, and shielding. It's the mantra. Minimize the time personnel spend exposed to the radioactive source or in the contaminated area. Maximize distance from the source. Radiation intensity decreases dramatically with distance, following the inverse square law, so doubling your distance typically quarters the dose rate. And utilize shielding.
What kind of shielding works best?
It depends on the type of radiation. For gamma rays and X-rays, you need dense materials, lead, steel, thick concrete, even packed earth. For neutrons, which we saw are part of the initial radiation, hydrogenous materials, things containing lots of hydrogen, like water, plastics, polyethylene, concrete, are effective at slowing them down and absorbing them. And of course, individual protective equipment, like masks and suits, is critical for preventing the inhalation or ingestion of radioactive particles, especially alpha emitters, which are extremely hazardous if they get inside the body.
Now, post-attack, logistics units themselves are going to be prime targets and likely severely degraded. What does the operations on the Integrated Battlefield Reference Book say about maintaining that essential support after an attack?
It's stark. Because your combat service support units, your logistics medical maintenance units will inevitably be hit hard and degraded, the doctrine demands that the tactical fighting forces must plan to be self-sufficient for at least 3 days, maybe longer.
3 days on their own. At a minimum, logistics commanders have to immediately recognize the severe constraints on resupply and start planning for alternate routes, because existing roads might be blocked by contamination, rubble from blast damage, or even just trees blown down over a wide area. Transportation becomes a nightmare. It might necessitate emergency air movement using helicopters, for instance, for the rapid resupply of critical items like water, medical supplies, or ammo, simply because ground movement might be too slow or too dangerous due to crossing contaminated terrain. Time and distance become even more critical for logistics planning.
And ultimately, the measure of whether a force can continue to fight effectively hinges on reconstitution, that ability to regain combat capability after taking severe losses. How does a unit actually pull itself back from the brink?
Reconstitution isn't just one thing. It's really a spectrum of activities. At the lower end, it might involve immediately replacing key personnel or leaders who have become casualties, or forming composite units, basically mashing together the depleted remnants of several units into one functional, albeit smaller unit. At the most drastic end is regeneration. That means pulling a severely depleted unit completely out of the fight, sending it to the rear, and essentially rebuilding it from the ground up with large numbers of replacements, both personnel and equipment.
That sounds like a long process.
It is. And the ability of any combat unit to accomplish its mission despite suffering these potentially catastrophic losses is hugely enhanced by things done beforehand like rigorous cross-training so soldiers can fill multiple roles, and standardization of equipment and procedures so parts and people are interchangeable between units.
We can't wrap this up without talking about the human factor again. The sheer psychological stress placed on soldiers operating day in, day out in this kind of lethal, uncertain environment must be immense.
Absolutely immense. The operations on the Integrated Battlefield Reference Book explicitly calls this out. The confusion of the battlefield, compounded by extreme lethality, the indivisible nature of the hazards of radiation, chemical agents you can't see or smell, and the unknowns about long-term health effects. All of this intensely amplifies fatigue and psychological stress. And just wearing the full MOPP gear day after day is itself a constant source of anxiety and stress. It hinders vision, movement, communication, even just breathing easily. It degrades critical thinking under pressure.
So what tools do commanders have to try and mitigate these intense human factors? How do they maintain cohesion when things get this bad?
The number one tool mentioned is training, realistic training. Commanders have to emphasize tough, realistic training in simulated chemical and nuclear environments, using the actual MOPP gear to build rock-solid confidence. Confidence in the equipment that will protect them, confidence in their buddies, and confidence in their junior leaders. They also need to use simple, clear, decentralized control procedures, especially at the lower levels of command. Empower junior leaders, capitalize on leadership strengths right down to the squad level, and constantly promote a deep sense of dedication to the unit and the mission to maintain that cohesion and perseverance needed for continuous, incredibly stressful operations. #outro. So, if we try to synthesize all of this, the modern reality reflected in Joint Publication 372 and the operations on the Integrated Battlefield Reference Book, it really demands that commanders view conflict from the very outset as a potential nuclear and chemical confrontation. There's no longer this clean idea of a distinct transition phase from purely conventional operations into nuclear or chemical ones. You really have to be manned, trained, and equipped to operate, survive, and ultimately win right across that entire spectrum from day one.
Yeah, and we've certainly covered that spectrum today. We went all the way back to Task Force Razor, driving through radiation fields in Nevada in the 1950s, right up to the complex strategic requirement for integrated deterrence today. We've seen that deterrence isn't just about having the weapons, it's about influencing the adversary's cost-benefit calculation. And that tactical survival on the ground relies on rigorous application of principles like dispersal, hardening, protection, and that constant balancing act with the MOPP levels.
We've definitely focused a lot on force protection, on survivability measures, but maybe the ultimate advantage, as shown by that stark requirement for 3-day self-sufficiency and the complex need for reconstitution after losses. Maybe the real edge lies not just in surviving the initial blast or the contamination cloud. Perhaps it lies more in the speed and effectiveness with which commander can adapt, regroup their remaining forces, and regain the initiative after being hit.
That leads to a really interesting final thought for you, our listeners, to ponder. If winning in this environment relies on fighting through nuclear or chemical effects and potentially requires complex, time-consuming reconstitution efforts just to stay in the fight, how fundamentally does that requirement change a commander's very definition of success in a major conflict? Does it shift the focus away from just achieving the initial objectives towards something more like long-term endurance and the ability to regenerate combat power? That's a profound question to carry forward, especially when we think about operating in an environment where time itself is so compressed and critical. Thank you for joining us for this intensive deep dive into the strategic and tactical frameworks for survival in what is truly the most complex operational environment imaginable.